We're live.
Hello! Hey everyone! Welcome to AP World. This is our part of our live stream on Saturdays. Today we're doing a DBQ step by step for the AP World History exam. So, what that means is I have made up a prompt for you. You have never seen this prompt before. I haven't really ever thought about this prompt before after just making it. And then we're going to walk through and I'm going to kind of write it right in front of your eyes where you can kind of ask me questions. We can watch the process together of, I don't know, how this works. Hi, Karina. Hi, Kami. Kami. Man, I say that every time. Tell me in the chat if I'm saying your name wrong. Okay, so let me pull up for you. If you want to follow along, I have made for you, I've posted this DBQ prompt on my website. So antisocialstudies.org is my website where you can go find, I have actually like 4 sample DBQs that are up there that you can use for practice. And in fact, all of them except for this one actually I've written out an answer and I have an annotated sample essay for you. So one of the things that's really cool is that you can then go see what an example DBQ would look like. So again, if you want to follow along, you're welcome. You can pull up this by going to my website, but I'm also going to kind of walk you through this on my own. And so this is one from Unit 8. I chose this one because I'm hoping that maybe some of y'all are learning about Unit 8 right now in your class, or maybe are about to. And so this will also serve as a good review for your class. Hopefully this will be helpful. So what I wanted to show you first before we get into the DBQ is this. So this is a worksheet that I made last year when all the tests were going to be online. And it was basically just a worksheet that you can use to kind of work through a DBQ. This is also up on my website. Obviously, some of you are going to be doing the test like on paper and pencil. So this won't be really maybe that helpful. Like it's not something you can use on test day, but it is helpful just to kind of understand how you should set up your DBQ. And the first thing I just wanted to really quickly talk about, and I want to see if y'all have questions about, which is the rubric, right? So I saw Tom was sort of talking about this in the last live for AP Euro, but you should not be trying to get all 7 points on the day of the AP exam. If you're writing a DBQ in your class and it's like on something you've just learned about and you feel really good about it, or if you have more time, maybe it's not timed as strictly, then yeah, go for it. Try to write the complex essay. Try to include everything. On the day of the AP test, I really think it's about being strategic. You want to walk in having a plan of thinking about, okay, what are like the 4 or the 5 points that I feel really confident in that I can do well on? Those are the ones I'm going to focus on. Because I've seen really, really good students try to do everything and then they end up kind of doing nothing, or they miss out on some easy points because they got distracted. So this is going to be like maximum an hour long. We're just using it as if we have the 60 minutes on the AP test, where I'm going to walk you through how I would structure this, how I would skim through each document, and then I'm going to write as much of the DBQ as I can. Obviously, it'll take me longer because I'll be kind of talking through it. So my biggest thing is I want you to walk away today seeing how I skim the documents and organize the documents, and then seeing how I decide what points I'm going to go for and which points I'm going to ignore. So my biggest tip, if you're just here for the first 5 minutes and then you're like, I'm out, is don't worry about complexity on the day of the test. Don't worry about it. You can do complexity if you have all the time in the world, but on test day, it's not worth it. And what I would suggest is that you sort of work your way from the more foundational points up to the more complicated points. So every single one of you should be trying to make a thesis statement and like addressing 3 of the documents, ideally maybe using 6 of the documents. Those to me are sort of the foundational ones. Like you don't have to know any outside information. You don't have to really know anything else. You can just use the 7 documents they give you, craft an answer, make a thesis statement. And that gets you almost half the points. That gets you 3 already, right? Then once you feel like you've done that, I would choose like 1 or 2 of these kind of medium points to add in to like get your score up higher. Because what we're really shooting for is like out of 7, we're shooting for maybe a 5. If we can get a 5 out of 7, That's awesome. If we get a 4 out of 7, that's great. So I always say you should be shooting for maybe 5 points, because then you either get them all and that's awesome. Maybe you mess one up and you get 4, that's still really good, right? And so what I always suggest is that you pick basically 5 of these points that you feel really good about. And to me, like, thesis and addressing 3 documents are like a requirement. You just have to, like, you can't really build any other sort of argument if you don't have that. And then you either use 6 of the documents, you add in context, you add in additional evidence, or you evaluate the documents. And I'll kind of walk you through each of those so that you can see what those look like. And then hopefully, you know, after today, you can kind of walk away with a plan of your own where you can think, okay, these are my 5 points that I'm going to for sure go for. And on the day of the test, I'm going to pretend that complexity doesn't exist. Again, keep practicing in your class. Okay, so the first step is reading the prompt. Don't just skip to the documents. Don't just read the prompt and then start going with the documents. So the prompt we're working with is this: evaluate the extent to which nationalism affected the process of decolonization in Africa in the 20th century. So what I always suggest that students do is they identify the keywords of the prompt. You can think of these two as like the parameters or the rules. Like, what are the specific things that they're forcing you to write about in this prompt? Another way to think of it is like, if you were going to try to Google and find this prompt on the internet, what words would you Google? You wouldn't Google evaluate. Like, there's gonna be a million responses. So to me, the main ones are nationalism, decolonization, Africa, 20th century. So what this is basically telling us is like, these are the 4 parameters, like the 4 walls, and everything you talk about as like evidence, applying the documents, whatever, needs to stay within those 4 walls. It needs to be about nationalism as it relates to decolonization. It needs to be in Africa, and it needs to be in the 20th century. Now, luckily on a DBQ, all the documents they're going to give you are going to be related to that. So that's great. The reason why you should identify that before you look at the documents is that this will help you skim. Students ask me every year, like, how can I skim through the documents more quickly? Identify the keywords of the prompt, because then that tells you what you're skimming for. So what you're skimming for is any evidence. You can assume that all the documents are going to be about Africa in the 20th century. They're not going to give you a document that doesn't apply to the prompt. So what you're now really looking for are any words or phrases that relate to either nationalism and or decolonization. You should skim, 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 and then when you see a word like our nation, stop, read more carefully, right? And then it gets into something else, skim, skim, skim. If you see a word like independence, stop, read really carefully, right? And that helps you skim. So let's do it. First, I'm just gonna skim the documents, and I am just gonna grab some basic evidence of like, what am I seeing about nationalism and decolonization? And then Cami, yeah, we're gonna then do context in just a second. So document 1, you should always read the source information first. You should always read the source information first. You should always read the source information first. It drives me crazy. I'm a grader. I grade DBQs for the AP exam, so I might be one of the people grading your DBQ this year. And it's amazing to me how many people miss some pretty helpful information if they just don't read the source. Because sometimes they will tell you, like, sometimes you can answer the prompt from the source information almost. So source 1, this is a dedication in the book Facing Mount Kenya by Jomo Kenyatta in 1938. Kenyatta would later become Kenya's first president. This is a great example of this. Students inevitably will skip that part, and then they'll be trying to analyze point of view later, and they're like, well, we don't know who Kenyatta was, but blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, they told you, right? Okay, so this is an African leader. He's going to be his first president. So I'm just looking for anything in this that relates to nationalism or decolonization. To dispossess youth, perpetuation of communion, ancestral spirits, fight for African freedom. Okay. They communed with ancestral spirits through the fight for African freedom and the firm faith that the dead, the living, the unborn will unite to rebuild the destroyed shrines. Oh, this is like sort of poetic. So, okay, what I have something like ancestral spirits, shrines will help fight for African freedom. I'm not like totally sure what I think about that yet, but I'm just like grabbing. I'm just grabbing stuff that is like, okay, these are the phrases or the things that sort of relate to the prompt. Right? They're referencing something about the ancestors that are going to like help them. They're going to unite, right? To kind of rebuild and fight for freedom. Okay, now I'm going to move on. I'm going to figure out what the heck that means a little bit later. Document 2 is a statement issued at the Fifth Pan-African Conference in 1954 held in England. We are not ashamed, patient, we continue to sacrifice, we're unwilling to starve while doing the world's drudgery in order to support false aristocracy, discarded imperialism. Okay, so this is basically just, it's the Pan-African Conference, so I assume this is like African leaders. African Conference, we've been patient, but we won't suffer under imperialism anymore. Okay. I will say I'm interested in the fact that this statement, like that the Pan-African Conference is held in England, is interesting to me. So that's where I'm just going to put that over here. I'm going to be like Pan-African Congress held in England, ? This is where like you do not need to force yourself to like evaluate every single document as you go. Like, do not stop and be like, what's the point of view of this? What's the intended audience? Because it's going to take up too much time. But if you notice something that you're like, that might be interesting to think more about later. That seems like a weird thing. Like, why would this African conference be in England? Just make a note of it. And then if you have time later, you can add it in. So your teacher at your school might have been like forcing you, I do it too, to like hip every document or be like, okay, I need you to go through and think about one of these elements. That's great. That's really good practice. On the day of the AP test, don't do that. On the day of the AP test, like if you just get through the 7 documents and figure out kind of what they mean and you don't do any evaluating yet, that's totally fine. Because again, that's one of those later points that's a little bit harder to get. So you don't want to like use up your time trying to think through like, okay, how could I hip or evaluate like the point of view, purpose, whatever of each of these documents. It's better to just like get your basic ideas down first. Okay, document 3, President Nasser, denouncement of the proposal for a Canal Users Association, 1956. All right. And this is where you might, like, this might jog your memory. You might be like, oh, Egypt, canal. Oh, right. I remember hearing something about the Suez Canal, and it wasn't just that a boat got stuck in it recently. So in these days, Egypt has resolved, nations, I'm going to stop, has resolved to show the world that when small nations decide to preserve their sovereignty, they will do that all right, and that when these small nations are fully determined to defend their rights and maintain their dignity, they will succeed. That is like nationalistic as heck. Okay. Today, the Egyptian people are fully conscious of their sovereign rights and he says the word nationalism. Thank you, Nasser. That's very helpful. Arab nationalism is fully awakened. Those who attack Egypt will never leave Egypt alive. Whoa, chill, Nasser. Okay, so we have something about a canal, but he doesn't really talk about the canal. He's just saying when small nations are determined, they will win their rights. And then he also talks about Egyptian people like are awakened and Arab nationalism. So I'm just kind of making notes of like, okay, these are the parts of this that I'm picking out to like then apply later to my argument, right? Okay. And again, like throwing stuff in the chat is awesome. I'll come back to some of those. We're going to come back and do like point of view, that sort of thing later if we have time. So document 4 is Kwame Nkrumah. I know who that is. You probably should too if you've learned Unit 8. So if not, throw him in your notes somewhere. He's giving a speech at the Independence Day celebrations in Ghana. Okay, so this is totally decolonization. And his speech says, at long last, the battle has ended. Your beloved country Ghana is free forever. New Africa is ready to fight. Show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. Demonstrate to other nations that we're prepared to lay our own foundation, our own African personality. All caps. Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of Africa. Okay. So what I'm seeing here is Ghana independence, but he's saying is not complete until all of Africa is independent. That sounds like some African nationalism to me, but I don't know. We'll talk more about it later. Okay. I'm just gonna say anytime I see like a political speech, like that's a good one to hip if you want to later, right? This is like an Independence Day speech. So like there's gonna be some clear bias in terms of like who he's speaking to, and like he's speaking, normally if it's like a politician and it's a speech, there's going to be a lot of opportunities to evaluate that document. Like, okay, there's going to be a lot of symbolic language, who's he speaking to, that sort of thing. So again, I'm not sitting there racking my brain for 5 minutes trying to figure out what his point of view is yet or intended audience. I'm just making a note that like, hey, if you have time, you should go back and maybe think about this later. Document 5 is a speech by the British Prime Minister to the Parliament of South Africa in 1960 after a tour visiting British colonies in Africa. Okay, so this is not an African leader. This is the British Prime Minister talking to South Africa. This is in the middle of apartheid. Oh, already, that's great context. 1960s South Africa apartheid as like historical situation. So again, if anything comes into your brain where you're like, oh, that's when this thing is happening in the country, again, just throw it in there. And if you have time later, you can use it as sort of context. The most striking since I left London, the strength of African national consciousness. It takes place in different forms, is happening everywhere. The wind of change is blowing through the continent. Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. We must accept it. Ooh, interesting. So British Prime Minister telling South Africa, African nationalism is here, and we need to accept that. Okay, that's going to be interesting. And that's going to be a really good one to maybe apply to the historical situation of this document. He's speaking to the South African Parliament, which is like an apartheid government, right? Okay. Document 6. Ooh, fun. It's an album cover for the music compilation for the first World Festival of Negro Arts. And this is where, like, if you skip the source information and just look at this, like, you're gonna be so lost. You're gonna be like, it's a stamp. Like, you'll have no idea what it is. It's so silly to me how many students will skip the source information, because the source information is gonna tell you everything about that you need to know, especially when it's an image. So this is an event hosted by the Senegalese president. It showcased Black literature, dance, visual art, and performances from across the continent and the US. Okay. And I'm seeing what looks like a traditional African sculpture. Cool. All right. So this is just like album cover, Black cultural festival celebrating Black heritage, art, etc. Okay. And then lastly, Nelson Mandela's inaugural address, South Africa. Never again will this land experience the oppression of one by another. A covenant, we shall build a society in which all South Africans, black and white, will be able to walk tall. A rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world. Okay. Mandela. Post-apartheid South Africa will be for black and white equally. Okay. So now I have gone through and I've gotten the basics from these documents. Again, this is the trick. A lot of students are like, how long should this take? Well, it sort of depends, right? Because some of y'all in the chat are like each document, then you're stopping and also thinking about like, okay, what could I talk about for point of view? What could I talk about for context? That's fine. Just be careful because you don't want to spend too much time planning out like all the different parts. You want to make sure you get some stuff down on the page. So what I always suggest is that you figure out your basic argument first. So again, I'm going to scroll back up. You figure out the basic argument you're going to make and what documents you're going to use before you worry too much about context, additional evidence, evaluating the documents. Okay. So what I would do then is I'm going to look at these and read the prompt again. Please read the prompt multiple times because a lot of students, the way they get really screwed up, like get a 0 on a DBQ, is if they just misread the prompt and answer the wrong question, right? So again, I'm trying to evaluate how or did nationalism affect decolonization in Africa. Evaluate the extent to which means put it on a spectrum. It means you have a spectrum. Over here is like completely nationalism affected decolonization in Africa 100% of the time. On the other end, you could evaluate and say, not at all. Nationalism had nothing to do with African decolonization. Both those are probably wrong. You're probably going to be somewhere in the middle. So when they say evaluate the responses to, evaluate the extent to which, they're just saying put it on a spectrum. Yes, no, kind of. Those are your 3 possible answers, always, right? So I think I'm gonna argue, yes, it did. But like, okay, I'm thinking it'll probably be in different ways, right? Because I'm seeing a lot of evidence of nationalism. Also, that just makes sense to me that like nationalism, of course, would affect decolonization. So my main answer is just going to be like, yes, it did affect decolonization. Okay, so like you have to have an answer. Now you got to figure out your reasoning though. Like what are your main arguments going to be? So am I noticing anything that might be able to be grouped together? So I'm curious too, if y'all want to put in the chat, like at this point, if you've looked through the 7 documents, I'm going to figure out the groups that make sense to me. I would love to see the groups that make sense to you. Like which documents would you use? Remember, you want to use at least 3, but I'm going to try to use 6. And I'm curious, like, what groups would you put them in? To me, I'm noticing, like, stuff about culture, right? I'm seeing, like, the Black Cultural Festival. I see stuff about spirits and shrines, which is, like, culture, ancestral worship, that sort of thing. Do I see anything else about culture? Not so much. Then there were a few documents that are sort of about, like, the broader, like, African nationalist movement. So not, like, nationalism in Kenya, but nationalism, like, around Africa. And so for me, that's, like, the Pan-African Congress itself, right, is kind of about African nationalism across the whole continent. And so is, like, all of Africa needs to be independent. And then this British Prime Minister is just informing the white South Africans, hey, y'all, like, there's this strong African nationalism that's happening. Okay, so I see 2 groups that make a lot of sense to me, where I would say, yes, it did affect decolonization. Many independence movements used traditional African culture to unite and motivate decolonization. That's kind of my first one. And then also many leaders promoted a sense of Pan-African unity to support each other in their efforts to decolonize. So what I'm sort of getting is, like, I'm talking about nationalism as it relates to kind of national culture, and then also like this bigger nationalism, like Black nationalism, African nationalism. Okay, I haven't really thought that hard about this. So this is my first draft of my thesis. I'm curious, right? So yeah, Cami, you're saying you put 3 and 7 into a group. Yeah, I mean, we can figure out what to do with 3 and 7 later. So you ideally don't want to group documents just because they're like a similar type of document. You know what I mean? You want to focus more on what they're saying. But to me, so what I'm seeing here is I'm seeing like Black African cultural pride is one topic. And within that, I'm going to talk about documents 1 and 6. Down here is like basically Pan-Africanism. And I'm going to talk about documents 2, 4, and 5. Now, I could stop there. I'm definitely addressing 3 documents, but I'm so close, right? I have 5 documents, and I get another point if I do 6. So I do want to figure out how to make one work. To me, it kind of seems like these 2 go together because they're a little bit different forms of nationalism. And Kimmy, actually, now that I'm reading your thing again, I think that's kind of what you were getting at, is like, to me, I almost would just do a 3rd topic where I would kind of say, like, unique. Like, unique forms of nationalism within diverse countries. Because then you'd talk about document 3, because Egypt is both African and Arab, right? That, like, makes them sort of unique. And then document 7, South Africa is Black and white. So to me, like, yeah, those kind of go together in that, okay, it's not as simple as like, we are all Black Africans in Ghana, which of course is not totally true, but majority are, and we are going to unite with other Black Africans around the continent. Well, in South Africa, you're like, but like a lot of our country's white Africans. And in Egypt, you're like, and a lot of our country's Arabs, which is a different ethnicity. So yeah, I think I would actually have 3 topics, which doesn't matter, right? People ask like, how many paragraphs do you need? It does not matter. I think typically you want to have 2 body paragraphs and maximum 3. You wouldn't want to have more than that. That's just like really cumbersome. The last thing, just as a heads up before we start kind of writing, is that you don't actually have to group the documents. Now, I think you should, but the reason I want you to know that is that if you panic, like if you're on test day and your brain just gets totally stuck and you're like, I can't think of how to group these, then just start explaining each document independently, right? Start writing. So like if you get stuck and you're staring at the page and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't even think of a group, whatever. And that's fine. Just start writing and go, okay, document 1. Document 1 is, a nationalist leader who's talking about the ancestors supporting their movement, and then kind of apply that to the prompt. Document 2 is this thing. Now, it's not as strong. It's good to group the documents. That helps you get the other points. But if you're just stuck and you're panicking, just start explaining each document separately. In theory, you could have like 7 body paragraphs where like each paragraph is you talking about a document separate, like individually. It's not a great essay, but it'll get you a few points, right? It's better than just staring at a blank page. Yeah, that's interesting. So like, yeah, I think that a lot of teachers really try to encourage you to do just 2 groups because you don't want to get too overwhelmed. But I think that like, it's really just about what makes sense in your brain, right? Like what makes sense to your brain. For me, there might have been an easier way to group these into just 2 groups. But to me, like the thing that came to my head first is like culture, Pan-Africanism, kind of weird ones, right? So those are my 3. So on all of these on the test, what you have to remember is that you're writing your first draft of an essay. You just don't get a chance to write a second draft, right? So you don't necessarily need to develop the best argument. You should go with your first good argument. So a lot of students also will get stuck because they'll be sitting there thinking about like, well, what's the strongest argument I can make? And it's like, you know what? I don't know if this is the strongest argument I can make, but like, it's a good argument. It makes sense. And it makes sense to me in my brain, and like time is of the essence. So I'm just going to use it and go. I'm not going to second guess this too much, right? Laura, you can have a paragraph with no documents, but it seems a little bit like, it depends on what you're doing in that paragraph. I mean, obviously if you're using like additional evidence and stuff, then yeah, totally. But you want everything you write in a DBQ should be purposeful. Like everything you write in a DBQ should be tied to one of these things so that you're really making use of your time. So, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to start writing. I have my thesis statement. It's not great. I'm going to maybe make it sound a little bit better. But let's say that this is what my essay is going to be. And here's the deal. If you're doing the first test that's with like pen and paper, you can still do what I'm going to show you. My kids are going to be typing theirs on the digital test. And so I'm teaching them like, hey, go through and get the basic essay down, then go back in and add information, which is easier to do on a computer. You can do it on pen and paper in 2 ways. You could leave some space in between each paragraph to go back. You also can just draw arrows. Like I've read DBQs on the official test where they like draw a long arrow and they're like, read this here. And I follow the arrow and I figure it out. So you can also do this. It does not need to be like perfectly formatted the first time around. So I'm actually just going to copy my thesis here and just make it sound a little bit better, like a little bit nicer. So I'm going to reread the prompt and I'm just going to say like nationalism greatly impacted the process of African decolonization. That's my answer. But a thesis statement has to have 2 things. It has to have an answer. So I'm saying yes, very much so. And then a line of reasoning, which are my next 2 sentences. Many independence movements use traditional African culture to unite and motivate decolonization. Also, many leaders promoted a sense of Pan-African unity to support each other in their efforts to decolonize. I don't really have anything in here about my third topic yet, but that's okay, because I'm kind of going to use this one to try to be kind of complex. Ooh, check me out. I'm going to use this one to try to be like, hey, here's an exception to this argument. So I might say also, I could say also, in their efforts to decolonize, although Egypt and South Africa were a slight exception to this trend. And now I've kind of covered everything, right? Okay, so now, like y'all, work smarter, not harder. Copy, paste. There's my topic sentence. Many independence movements use traditional African culture to unite and motivate decolonization. Now I'm going to go back to the 2 documents I said I was going to use to be like, wait, do I remember what this is? So now I'm just going to apply what I found in this document to my answer. I want you to notice, here is what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to say, document 1 is a book written by Jomo Kenyatta, who would become the first president. In this book, he writes a dedication at the beginning where he gives it to all the youth of Africa. That's summarizing the document. You can assume that the person grading your DBQ, again, picture me, you can assume I have this document right next to me. So you don't have to like summarize or describe the whole thing to me. You just have to take the specifics from it and apply it to your argument. So, Kenyatta's book was literally dedicated to the young people of Africa fighting for independence. To support their cause, he called on the ancestral spirits who would support them, period. Okay, document 1. That's it. That's all I need to do to get a point for using, to like use that document. Now, sure, okay, add one more sentence where it's like, this references traditional African beliefs about ancestral worship and the ability to commune with your ancestors in the afterlife. We've all seen Black Panther. Yes, that's what this is. Black Panther is an amazing movie. Okay. Now, document 1. I've used it. Yeah, we're gonna talk about outside evidence in just a second. We're gonna talk about context in just a second, and how to context if you're not totally sure what you're talking about. I just want to get my basics of the essay down. Now I'm gonna go to 6, which is the album cover. Even after independence, many new leaders promoted traditional African culture to celebrate decolonization. In Senegal, there was a World's Festival highlighting African artists and even Black artists from the United States. Document 6. Okay. Boom. Now, let's pause here. So let's say, okay, I have a thesis statement. I have my first argument where I'm using 2 documents. Then we're going to do the same thing for the next argument, but I'm going to pause. Let's just kind of pretend this is our essay for now. First, let's talk about context versus outside evidence, because this trips people up sometimes. So let's go back to our prompt, and let's go back to these bold words, right? If you've identified the keywords of the prompt, this is going to help you decide what is outside evidence and what is context. So additional evidence has to follow all the rules of the prompt. So for something to be an appropriate additional piece of evidence, it needs to be related to nationalism and decolonization in Africa in the 20th century. All of those things have to be true for it to count as additional evidence, right? Interesting. And so for here, what that would mean is like, I would have to know another example of a Black leader post-independence using traditional African culture. And I actually happen to know that because I'm the teacher. So let me show you what an example of an additional piece of evidence for this would look like. Similarly, or no, I'll just say in the Congo, after independence, a military dictatorship rose. In order to maintain power and promote unity under the new brutal government, the leader renamed the country Zaire after the traditional African kingdom that had been in the region before colonization. Now, I might be like, this is slightly different from the previous examples because this was a leader using nationalism against his own people to maintain power, as opposed to promoting freedom and independence. Okay, so now I'm talking about like, okay, right after decolonization, right? I should just say after decolonization, a military dictator. And now I'm saying, and this is a guy using traditional African culture, but hey, he's using it in a different way, right? Oh yeah, Cammy. So like there's a scene in Black Panther where they can go and kind of visit with their ancestors and that sort of thing. And that's based on true, like a lot of different African religious traditions. So this would be additional evidence because it's related to nationalism and decolonization in Africa in the 20th century. Now, context means you go back to these keywords and you zoom out of one or more of these. So you could talk about nationalism and decolonization not in Africa in the 20th century. So if we wanted to do that, if we wanted to zoom out of Africa, we could talk about Gandhi. And did he use nationalism? He did, right? You could, if you wanted to contextualize, like let's say we want to zoom out from Africa, our context could be in the 20th century, colonized people around the world were using nationalism to promote independence. In India, Gandhi actively promoted traditional Indian practices like weaving in his like homespun movement to build pride in the Indian people and motivate them to push for full independence from England. Then you could say like, similarly, and then move into your thesis statement. So that's how you could zoom out and contextualize Africa, right? So like, okay, I'm going to zoom out from Africa. What other parts of the world at the same time are doing something similar? You also could zoom out. I think the two easiest ones are either zoom out of the geographic region or zoom out of the time period. So let's say I wanted to zoom out from the 20th century, right? I could talk about like before the 20th century, African people had been resisting European interference. I need to talk about some specifics though. Through wars like the Zulu Wars against the British and cultural movements like the Oza cattle killing movement. They attempted to maintain their independence. Unfortunately, these were unsuccessful. And so many leaders in the 20th century attempted to strengthen resistance by appealing to nationalism. So again, you always want to like then connect it back to whatever you're about to talk about, right? So these are two different examples of what context could be. So for those of you who are like, how do we contextualize without knowing a lot? It's tricky. I mean, you have to know some stuff because context needs to be kind of specific, but the point is there's not just one way to contextualize, right? So you could think about, okay, maybe I don't know a lot about Africa, but I know a lot about decolonization movements in other parts of the world. I know about the Vietnam War and that sort of thing. Or you're like, oh, I don't really know about a lot about decolonization, but I know about what was going on in Africa before the 20th century, right? Yeah, Karina, like you could talk about what led to nationalism in Africa. So you could talk about, so this is like what caused nationalism, right? You could say, talk about the World Wars, right? After African colonial subjects had fought and died for their imperial states in the world wars, many began to develop their own sense of nationalism. There was pride in fighting against Nazi imperialism and racism that then those African leaders applied to their own situation when they returned home after World War II. Boom. Right? And so, again, it's like all of these could be context. Any of them could be. And you should only do one, to be clear. You should not do all of these. The point is, like, there's sort of an infinite number of ways you can contextualize. You just have to make sure it applies to what you're going to argue. You can't just be like, hey, before the 20th century, Africa was devastated by the slave trade. Let me tell you a bunch of stuff about the slave trade in the Middle Passage. I'd be like, so what does that have to do? What does that have to do with it? You would then want to link it and be like, it is through this trauma that led to this African diaspora where now there are Black people all around the world who are finally coming back together and reuniting under nationalism. So like you can do that. You can talk about almost anything as long as you connect it back to what you're going to argue. And so the biggest thing about context is that they just want to know that you know that it's not like all of a sudden in the 1900s, African people were like, hey, let's be independent. Like, that it doesn't just happen out of nowhere. They want to know that you understand the bigger picture. And so that could be the bigger picture of like what else is going on at the same time, or that could be the bigger picture of like what was happening before this era. Now, if you don't know a lot, I will say there are some standard ones, like in general, like if you're trying to contextualize like the 20th century, then either like the European kind of competitions from the 1800s is a good one. Nationalism is typically a good context to talk about stuff from the 20th century, that sort of thing. If you're trying to talk about like imperialism and conquest, industrialization tends to be good. If you're talking about industrialization, imperialism tends to be good. They kind of serve each other, right? So if you're talking about political revolutions, the Enlightenment, there's a few events that tend to serve as context for a lot of topics. To me, that's like the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, imperialism, and nationalism. Like those I find used as context a lot. But again, you still have to apply it to whatever you're gonna talk about. So let's see. Okay, Cami, another person or point of view would want to hear from him why. No. And I say that only because that used to be a point. There used to be a point that was like, identify another document that you wish you had. And that's not a point anymore. So additional evidence needs to be like a real thing that exists, right? So it needs to be a real thing of a separate event. What you're basically doing with additional evidence is you're just kind of coming up with an eighth document. Now, it doesn't have to be a literal document, right? But you can imagine how they could have put like a picture of this military dictator with his new, state of Zaire in his like cheetah skin fez, which is what he always wore. And like, then that could have been another thing. Okay. So let's also, just so that we get a chance to look at evaluating the documents too. So let's say I wanted to take, I don't know, let's pick which I kind of like, I like this context the best because I think it's the most specific and the most applicable to what we're talking about. So let's just say that's going to be my context. Similarly, period. Okay. You could talk about Pan-Africanism around the world, but but did it? I mean, you can talk about it forming in the United States, I guess, but you want to be careful that you don't stay too close to what you're actually going to talk about. Because if you're actually going to talk about the Pan-African movement as your evidence, then I would be careful about using that as context too, because you don't want them to overlap, right? Yeah, Cami, that's not part of the rubric anymore. It used to be. Okay, so let's now talk about how we might evaluate a document for its purpose, point of view, whatever. Honestly, I don't think either of these are very good candidates. I think like evaluating an image is really hard. I would not, if you can, I would try to avoid evaluating an image. Like, we could, but I'm gonna start writing my next paragraph because I think there's a lot of good candidates for that one. So again, my next one was gonna be, many leaders promoted a sense of Pan-African unity to support each other. Okay. Because this is where there were some like political speeches and that sort of thing. So promoted a sense of Pan-African unity. Right, I'm talking about 2, 4, and 5. So 2, right, okay. There was a literal Pan-African movement that developed in the 20th century and held a series of conferences to promote their shared goals. One statement from a conference asserted that the African people were patient. Actually, let's simplify this. We're running out of patience and would no longer allow their people to suffer under imperialism. Document 2. Now, I had a note about this one. I was like, it's kind of weird that it's in England, isn't it? It seems kind of strange. So I think for me, the historical situation of this document is really interesting. It's in 1945, which I know is like the year World War II ends, and it's being held in England. And so I would talk about now the historical situation of the document. A lot of people mistake this for just general context. What the historical situation means is like, you're now going to very specifically contextualize this document, 1945, England. So I'm like post-World War II. It is interesting to note that this Pan-African conference was actually held in England, not in Africa. This might be because Africa was still part of European empires in 1945. It wouldn't be until after, no, that's confusing, in 1945. Interestingly, the end of World War II, 1945, is one of the main things that will spark the decolonization movement, partly because European countries are so weakened from the war, but also because African nations develop their own sense of pride after fighting in the war, as seen in document 2. That's evaluating a document. It's like you really are like, okay, what's happening in England in 1945 that helps me better understand this document? And the thing I just want you to notice is that that takes a long time. Like it's a lot. And you have to get 1 point, you have to do that 3 times. So you can see why I'm suggesting, okay, do thesis statement, develop your argument first, do context and additional evidence, then if you have time, do evaluating the documents. Because this is by far, besides these like foundational points, this is the most work. It's way faster to come up with like a piece of context or a piece of additional evidence than it is to evaluate 3 different documents, right? Let's do another one though, just so that we can get some more practice in. So now, because now I've used 3 documents. So if I were to stop right now, if my teacher was like, time, put your pencils down. Okay, how many points do I have? I have context, that's 1. I have a thesis statement, that's 2. I've addressed 3 documents, that's another point. And I have an additional piece of evidence. That's a 4. So like I could stop right now, and if I run out of time, I don't have a conclusion, I didn't talk about the other documents I said I was going to talk about, but I could have 4 out of the 7 points. This is why I say be strategic. Don't spend too much time planning out your perfect essay, because you probably won't get a chance to write your perfect essay. It's better to just kind of write what you can in the time you're given. But again, I have, 10 minutes left. So if I get to this point, I'm like, I have 10 minutes left. Now let me think strategically about what would be more worth my time. I could go back and try to evaluate these 2 documents, but like, I don't really know what I would say. So I'm just going to keep on trucking and try to get to at least 6 documents so that I get another point. So now I go back and remind myself, all right, I was also going to use document 4, Kwame Nkrumah's speech. Okay. So I'm going to add it in here. One of the leaders of the Pan-African movement was Kwame Nkrumah. In fact, and this is information I know. So actually, in fact, he was one of the main organizers of many of the conferences mentioned in the previous document. In his independence speech, he asserts that Ghanaian independence is only the first step, and that Black African people will only truly be free and decolonized. Notice I'm trying to use the word national or nation and decolonized throughout, just so I kind of remind myself, like, this is what you're talking about, right? Once every African nation is free. Document 4. Okay. I could hit that. I'll do that if I have time. What were the other documents I was going to use? I was going to use 5. Right. Even white foreigners understood that African nationalism was growing. The British Prime Minister warns the South African government about the power of African national consciousness. Even more telling, he believes that white people need to accept it as a fact, not push against it, which goes to show just how powerful he believed nationalism to be in Africa. Okay. All right. So now I've done 5 documents, right? I don't want to leave with just 5 because I get a whole other point if I can use one more. So I'm going to use one of my weird ones. I'm going to use the South Africa one. The last one's a little bit strange to me because it jumps ahead in time. So I'm going to go back and use the Egypt one. And I might even just start a new paragraph. I might say, like, there were some countries that had a more complicated relationship with nationalism. Egypt straddles 2 regions, both Africa and the Middle East. So they could be part of the Pan-African movement, but seemed to more closely connect with Arab nationalism. Nasser refers to the power of the Arab nation when he threatens outsiders who attempt to attack Egypt and violate its sovereignty. Document 3. Okay, now I've used 6 documents. Whew. So now I'm like, do I have a little bit of time to go back and try to do some of the evaluating the documents? For document 2, could the evaluation be about intended audience? Ooh, let's go look at that. Which one was document 2 again? Ooh, this one. Okay. Oh, interesting. Yeah, you could do intended audience, but I guess the trick is, like, we're not totally clear who the intended audience is in this one. You know what I mean? Like, it was a statement issued, but we don't really know to whom. Who was it issued to? You know what I mean? Like, and in fact, I just know because, again, I teach the class, that actually this statement was issued, but like the English press didn't publicize it. They were like, this is just a silly little event they had. We don't really need to know much about it. So the trick with intended audience is that you need to make sure you know specifically who the audience is. You know what I mean? And so if you don't, like on this one, you know, you might end up kind of being too general, being like, the audience was for people who should know that Africa would no longer, like, for a lot of people, intended audience or purpose, they end up just sort of rephrasing the document. So I would only use intended audience if it's clear. If it's like, this is a speech to this group, or this is a letter to this person, or whatever. What I would say is that I could talk about historical situation because I know a little bit about the Suez Canal, right? So, but we already did one of those. So I want to show you something different. I want to show you like point of view. Let's see, point of view or intended audience. Let's do, I think the intended audience of this one's really interesting. So, because he's speaking to a bunch of other white South Africans, right? So I would say like the fact that the Prime Minister is speaking so openly about the strength of African nationalism to an all-white government in South Africa is important, whatever. Okay. This audience specifically would not be happy to hear about Black Africans pushing for more power and needing to be heard. Even so, the Prime Minister is essentially warning them that if they are not careful, the wind of change might topple their apartheid system, right? So that's an example of like intended audience where it's like, you know who he's talking to and it's interesting. It tells you something. I'm like, this speech is even more powerful to me because he's not pandering to he's not speaking to Nelson Mandela. He's not pandering to Black Africans who would love to hear this. He's telling this to like the white supremacist government in South Africa, which to me makes this document even more powerful and even more like reliable of like, whoa, this African nationalism must have been really strong because even all white dudes are talking about it. You know what I mean? Like, which is pretty crazy. So again, that's what, like, for intended audience, you want to make sure you really clearly know who they're talking to or writing it for, so that then you can apply it. Okay. So what I've done is I think I've ended up with a 5. I think if I'm like running out of time, I could try to throw one more in. Like I might be like really quickly, like the historical situation of this document is right after the Suez Canal crisis. This probably explains why Nasser uses such aggressive language, because they had just been invaded by Israel, backed by England and France. So like I'm gonna throw one more in and try and hope that maybe that's all 3. But if nothing else, what the strategy I want you to walk away with is like building your essay piece by piece. Don't sit there silently staring at a blank page for 20 minutes planning it out and then write it. Build it as you go, so that if at any point like time's up or whatever, you have points already there. Right? So once you think of your thesis, write it on the page. Leave yourself some space to go back and add context when you get to that part, right? And so I would approach each part of the rubric with whatever are the easiest points for you. So if you struggle with context, don't worry about context at first. Just get your thesis down and start writing, and maybe you'll think of it later, right? We're going to be doing more of these. I want to honor time. I know I'm like talking right up until the end of this. So we're going to be doing more of these. I also have some of these videos over on my YouTube channel, Anti-Social Studies. And so make sure that you're subscribed to both these channels, because I will be popping up on my own Anti-Social Studies and also on the Marco Learning channel to do more of these sessions. The next one we do, I think I'm going to do a step-by-step for the short answer question section, because that's going to be a big part of both the tests, especially the digital one. So make sure that you're following us and subscribe so that you can see